Well, at this point, we know that there was a husband, a wife, and at least their child inside of this home at the time of this shooting. Take a look here behind me. The scene is still very active. It is contained at the moment. Prince George's County Police say they received a call, at least one this morning at about 5:45, regarding a shooting. They arrived on scene to find a man shot to death.
Welcome to the Crime Reporting. In today's episode, we take a closer look at a real criminal case that made headlines and left a lasting impact on everyone involved. Using publicly available information, official records, and verified reporting, we'll carefully examine the events, the investigation, and what ultimately happened. Before we begin, subscribe to the Crime Reporting and turn on notifications so you never miss a new true crime investigation. We'd also love to know where you're watching from, so leave your city and country in the comments below. Now, let's begin today's case. This version sounds more like a professional true crime documentary and is suitable for any case. A phone left unlocked on a nightstand. That is where this one begins, not with a stranger in the dark or a plan carried out over months, but with a single cheap secret sitting inside a device its owner probably thought was hidden well enough. It wasn't. What his wife found on that second phone would end his life within hours, inside their own bedroom, in a quiet, tight-knit neighborhood where neighbors would later say they never saw it coming, that the couple looked, from the outside, like one of the happy ones. This is the story of a big, gentle man remembered by friends as having a heart even larger than his frame, a marriage that looked stable enough to fool an entire street, and a woman who, according to her own account to police, went looking for the truth and came out the other side holding a gun. There was no elaborate scheme here, no months of surveillance or careful staging. There was a discovery, an argument, and a decision made somewhere in the space of a single overnight hour that could never be taken back. This is the case of Damian Ward and Nicole Lanett Ward, out of Bowie, Maryland. Damian Ward was 53 years old, a Bowie resident with deep roots in the community and a reputation, among the people who actually knew him, as someone almost impossible to dislike. Neighbors described him as a big, friendly guy with an even bigger heart, the kind of presence that made a quiet suburban street feel a little warmer. A close friend, Gilberto Frederick, used the phrase gentle giant to describe him, a description that seems to have stuck with almost everyone who spoke publicly about him after his death. He was a father, with a young daughter whose life had been built, at least in part, around the home on Old Chapel Road where he would ultimately be killed. His own father, Greg, would later share a public tribute describing his heart as truly broken, language that seemed to gesture, without saying it outright, toward the betrayal that investigators say sat underneath everything that happened that night. Bowie itself is the kind of Prince George's County suburb built around exactly the image Damian Ward's neighbors described: quiet cul-de-sacs, long-time residents who know each other by name, the sense of a community where violence, when it does arrive, almost never comes from outside the neighborhood. It comes, as it did here, from inside one of the houses everyone assumed they already understood. Nicole Lanett Ward was 50 years old, Damian's wife, and by every outward account from the people who lived around them, an equal half of what looked like a genuinely happy marriage. Neighbors in the unincorporated section of Bowie, where the couple lived, described both of them as great neighbors, the kind of pair whose relationship other people on the block pointed to as an example of one that worked. Little of Nicole Ward's personal history beyond that has entered the public record, no detailed account yet of her career, her upbringing, or the earlier years of the marriage. What exists instead is a single, devastating night, reconstructed almost entirely through her own words to police in the hours after it happened, and a community left trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the charging documents that followed. That absence of a fuller public biography is itself worth noting. Cases that unfold over months or years tend to accumulate detail. Coworkers who come forward, old classmates who remember something telling, financial records that get pulled apart in court filings. A case that resolves this quickly, with a suspect never at large and a confession secured within hours, often leaves the wider public record comparatively thin. Less because there is nothing to know and more because the machinery of investigation simply never needed to dig that deep to build its case. The couple lived together in a home in the 13,200 block of Old Chapel Road, in the unincorporated part of Bowie, Maryland, a quiet residential pocket of Prince George's County. Whatever tension had been building inside that marriage, it stayed invisible to the people around them. By every account gathered after the fact, from neighbors to friends to Damien's own father, this looked, from the outside, like a stable, ordinary household, not the kind of home anyone expected police to be called to in the middle of the night. According to charging documents later made public, the events of that night began with something almost mundane, an argument that started, as arguments do, over something specific, and then widened. Nicole Ward told investigators that she had come across a second cell phone belonging to her husband, one apparently kept separate from the phone he used openly around the house and their daughter. On it, she said, she found photographs and text messages that convinced her Damien was carrying on an extramarital affair with another woman. Whatever the exact content was, it was enough to end whatever peace had existed in that home up to that point in an instant. There is a particular cruelty built into the discovery of a second phone specifically, as opposed to a suspicious text on a shared device or a rumor passed along by a friend. A second phone implies structure, a deliberate, ongoing effort to maintain a separate line of communication invisible to a spouse, which tends to read less like a lapse in judgment and more like sustained, organized deception. Whatever Nicole Ward believed about her marriage before that night, the second phone appears to have collapsed it in the space of however long it took her to scroll through what was on it. It is worth pausing on how common this exact scenario has become in the era of constant digital connectivity. A second, hidden phone used to conduct an affair is no longer a rare discovery in modern infidelity cases. It has become one of the more frequent methods by which betrayed spouses first learn the truth, precisely because a device kept secret leaves behind the kind of concentrated, undeniable evidence that older forms of infidelity, a late night out, an unexplained absence, rarely provided in the same immediate, irrefutable way. Where older generations of betrayed spouses often lived for years with suspicion they could never quite confirm, a discovered phone tends to deliver the entire truth all at once, with no room left for doubt, denial, or a slower emotional adjustment to what has been found. Nicole Ward's own account, given to police in the aftermath, described what happened next in fairly direct terms. She confronted her husband with what she had found. According to the charging documents, she told him to pack his bags and leave the house, an ultimatum that suggests, at least in that initial moment, she was trying to end the marriage rather than his life. That detail matters. It places the earliest phase of the confrontation within an entirely ordinary, if devastating, category of domestic conflict, a betrayed spouse issuing an ultimatum in the heat of discovery, the kind of scene that plays out in homes across the country most nights without ever escalating into anything close to violence. But the confrontation did not stay contained to words. The argument continued, escalating inside their bedroom, and at some point during that continued fight, Nicole Ward retrieved a firearm, a .357 Smith & Wesson Magnum revolver, and fired it, striking her husband. Officers with the Prince George's County Police Department were dispatched to the home at approximately 1:45 in the morning on July 19, 2025, responding to a reported shooting. When they arrived, they found Damien Ward inside, suffering from a gunshot wound. Emergency personnel attempted life-saving measures at the scene, but he was pronounced dead there, in the same bedroom where the argument had reached its final, irreversible point. The gap between the discovery of the phone and the arrival of the first responding officers appears, based on the timeline reconstructed from police reports, to have spanned only a matter of hours, a compressed window that left almost no room for either person in that house to step back, cool down, or reach out to anyone outside the marriage before the situation reached its conclusion. Nicole Ward was present when officers arrived and was taken into custody without incident. During subsequent questioning, she provided investigators with a detailed account of the sequence of events, from her discovery of the second phone, through the confrontation, to the moment she pulled the trigger. That confession, combined with physical evidence recovered from the scene, including cartridge casings consistent with the recovered weapon, gave prosecutors what they needed to move quickly. She was charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, first and second-degree assault, reckless endangerment, and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. A judge ordered her held without bond at the Prince George's County Department of Corrections, citing the severity of the charges. That kind of full, cooperative statement so soon after a killing is not unusual in domestic homicide cases specifically. In contrast to cases involving strangers or premeditated schemes, where suspects often lawyer up immediately and say nothing. Investigators who work these cases regularly note that a spouse who has just killed a partner in the heat of a discovered betrayal frequently has not yet processed the legal consequences of what has happened, and speaks to police less out of strategy than out of the same emotional momentum that carried the confrontation itself, still explaining, still justifying. In the same register the argument had been conducted in only minutes earlier. In the days that followed, the case drew attention less for its complexity than for how quickly it seemed to resolve on paper, and how completely it upended the image the surrounding community had of the people at its center. Investigators had a suspect who had never left the scene, a confession secured within hours, a recovered weapon, and a motive that fit cleanly into a familiar and painfully common category: jealousy following the discovery of infidelity. From a pure investigative standpoint, there was very little left to determine. What remained unresolved was everything else: a young daughter who had lost her father, and, in a different but no less real sense, lost the version of her mother that existed before that night. A father named Greg still living locally, grieving a son whose death was tangled up publicly with the circumstances of his own alleged betrayal, and a neighborhood forced to reckon with how little the appearance of a happy marriage can sometimes tell you about what is actually happening behind a closed bedroom door. The charges themselves reflect the layered way Maryland law approaches a homicide like this one. First-degree murder requires prosecutors to prove premeditation, a deliberate decision to kill formed before the fatal act itself, even if that deliberation only existed for a matter of seconds or minutes. Second-degree murder, filed alongside it, gives prosecutors a fallback path to a conviction if a jury ultimately concludes the killing was intentional but not premeditated in the way the law requires for the more serious charge. The additional counts, first and second-degree assault, reckless endangerment, and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, build in further layers of accountability tied to the act itself and the danger it posed beyond the immediate victim, since a fired weapon inside an occupied home carries risk that extends past the person it ultimately strikes. Taken together, the charging structure gives prosecutors multiple paths to a conviction while leaving the court, and eventually a jury, to sort out exactly how deliberate Nicole Ward's actions were once the argument reached its breaking point. As of the most recent public records, Nicole Ward's case remains in the pretrial phase of the Maryland court system, moving through preliminary hearings and scheduling toward an eventual trial. She has not yet stood before a jury, and no final legal determination of her guilt or innocence, beyond the charges themselves, has yet been reached. Technical analysis. From an evidentiary standpoint, this is very nearly the opposite of the kind of case that takes investigators months or years to break. There was no missing suspect, no ambiguous crime scene, No need to build a case slowly out of circumstantial fragments. Officers arrived to find the alleged shooter still present, the weapon recoverable, and a confession delivered voluntarily within the same window of hours as the shooting itself. That combination, physical presence, physical evidence, and a matching verbal account, is about as close to a fully corroborated case as homicide investigators tend to encounter. The recovered cartridge casings and the revolver itself will matter far more at trial for confirming the specific mechanics of what Nicole Ward has already described than for establishing whether she was the shooter in the first place, since that fact does not appear to be seriously in dispute. What will likely become the actual legal battleground, if this case proceeds to a full trial rather than resolving through a plea, is not what happened, but how the law characterizes it, whether prosecutors can establish the premeditation required for a first-degree murder conviction against a defense that will almost certainly argue this was a crime of passion, an unplanned escalation born out of a discovery made only hours, or even minutes, before the trigger was pulled. That distinction between a killing that was planned and one that erupted out of a specific, devastating moment is where cases like this are typically won or lost in court, far more than in the initial gathering of evidence. The choice of weapon itself is also worth examining forensically. A revolver, unlike a semi-automatic pistol, does not automatically eject spent casings after each shot. They remain in the cylinder until manually removed. That detail matters for how investigators reconstruct a shooting scene, since casings recovered at the location of a revolver discharge tend to confirm the number of rounds fired more reliably than scattered semi-automatic brass, which can travel and bounce unpredictably across a room. It also matters for the broader picture of premeditation, since a .357 Magnum revolver is not the kind of weapon typically carried on a person during an argument. It suggests the firearm was already present in the home, likely stored somewhere accessible, and retrieved specifically once the confrontation escalated past words. Whether that retrieval reflects a split-second decision made in the heat of betrayal, or something closer to a deliberate choice to arm herself before continuing the fight, is likely to become one of the central questions prosecutors and defense attorneys argue over as the case moves toward trial. Psychological analysis. What makes a case like this difficult to sit with is not its complexity but its ordinariness. There is no elaborate scheme here, no months of planning, no financial motive requiring a spreadsheet to untangle. There is a marriage that looked, from every external vantage point available, like a good one, and a piece of hidden evidence on a second phone that apparently dismantled that appearance in a single night. Nicole Ward's own initial instruction to her husband to pack his bags and leave suggests a woman who, in the first moments of that confrontation, was still operating within the ordinary logic of a marriage ending angry, betrayed, but oriented toward separation rather than violence. Something shifted between that ultimatum and the moment the gun was fired, and it is that shift, more than anything else in the case, that will occupy prosecutors, defense attorneys, and eventually a jury. Infidelity discovered in real time, rather than suspected or rumored, has a way of collapsing a person's sense of time and consequence very quickly, turning what might otherwise have been a devastating but survivable conversation into something that escalates faster than either person involved may have believed possible. None of that explains away what happened. It simply helps explain why a community that saw two people who looked happy together had no way of anticipating what was actually happening beneath that surface, and why the people closest to a marriage are so often the last to see its true condition until it is too late to intervene. There is also a broader pattern worth noting here, not to excuse Nicole Ward's actions, but to place them in context. Domestic homicides that erupt in the immediate aftermath of a discovered betrayal follow a recognizable psychological shape, distinct from the calculated, insurance-driven or premeditated killings that dominate so much of true crime storytelling. These are not cases built around motive, discovered slowly by investigators piecing together financial records or search histories. The motive here announces itself within hours, sometimes within the same night, because the emotional trigger and the violent response are compressed into a single continuous event, rather than spread across weeks of planning. That compression is precisely what makes these cases so difficult for the legal system to sort cleanly into categories built for either cold, calculated murder or clear-cut self-defense. Nicole Ward's own words to police, telling her husband to leave rather than immediately reaching for the weapon, suggest a person whose first instinct was toward separation, not violence. Something in the continuation of that argument moved her from one instinct to the other, and untangling exactly what that was, whether rage, panic, humiliation, or some combination none of those single words fully captures, is likely to be the emotional and legal center of gravity for whatever trial eventually follows. The proximity irony. What stands out most about this case, set against so many others in this genre, is the almost complete absence of distance between decision and consequence. There was no waiting period, no cooling off, no interval in which either person in that bedroom had the chance to leave the room, sleep on it, or call someone else into the situation. The phone was found, the confrontation began, and within the same continuous stretch of night, it was over. Compare that to cases built on months of planning, insurance policies, hired accomplices, elaborate cover stories constructed in advance. This case has none of that architecture. It has a marriage, a secret, a bedroom, and a weapon that was, by all accounts, already in the house before that night began, not acquired for the occasion but simply present, the way firearms often are in ordinary homes that never expect to need one. That immediacy is its own kind of tragedy. Nothing about the outcome required advanced planning or criminal sophistication. It required only proximity, a hidden truth surfacing at the worst possible moment, inside a home with no distance left to put between the discovery and its consequences. There is a second, quieter irony sitting inside the timeline itself. Nicole Ward's first documented instinct, according to her own account, was toward exactly the kind of resolution that domestic violence advocates and family counselors would consider the safest possible response to a discovery like this one. Tell him to leave. Put physical distance between yourself and the person who betrayed you. Remove the immediate presence of the conflict from the room. That instinct, had it held, would have ended the night with a marriage over but two people alive. A painful but survivable outcome that plays out in households across the country far more often than it does not. What separates this case from all of those ordinary, devastating breakups is not the discovery itself, which is common enough to be almost unremarkable as a category of human experience, but whatever happened in the narrow window between that initial ultimatum and the moment a weapon already present in the house entered the confrontation. It is a reminder of how thin the margin can be between a marriage that ends in a courtroom over furniture and custody, and one that ends in a courtroom over a homicide charge, and how little warning either the people involved or the community around them tends to get before that margin disappears entirely. For the neighborhood surrounding Old Chapel Road, the case has left behind a specific and uncomfortable kind of unease, the sense that appearances, even sustained over years, cannot be fully trusted as evidence of what is actually happening inside a home. People who described Damien and Nicole Ward as great neighbors and a seemingly happy couple were not being naive or inattentive. They were reporting exactly what was visible to them, which is, in the end, the entire limitation of that kind of judgment. A marriage can look stable from a driveway, a barbecue, a wave across a shared fence line, right up until the night it does not. That gap between visible stability and private crisis is not unique to this case, but few cases illustrate it as starkly. A community fully convinced of a couple's happiness only days before one of them would be dead and the other in custody without bond. Damien Ward's daughter is left now to grow up with a father remembered by his friends as gentle, and by his own father as the center of a broken heart, and a mother whose fate will be decided not in the chaos of that bedroom, but in the far slower, far more deliberate machinery of a Maryland courtroom still working its way toward a verdict. That concludes today's case. Every crime leaves behind victims, families, and unanswered questions that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this case with us. If you have any thoughts or opinions, share them in the comments below. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Crime Reporting and turn on notifications so you never miss a new true crime investigation. Thank you for watching the Crime Reporting. Stay safe, take care, and we'll see you in the next case.